Think about this statistic for a second. Over 859 million people, that's what, 12.5% of everyone on the planet,
That's huge.
currently living outside their country of origin. They're part of what we call a diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
And it really makes you ask, what happens when that many people move across borders? How does it reshape things, especially through a religious lens?
That's exactly what we're digging into today. This deep dive is all about that intersection, global diasporas and mission, how the movement of people connects with their religious beliefs, their practices.
And how it changes things.
Right, often in really surprising ways.
So to guide us, we've got this fantastic collection of academic essays. They're part of the Regnum Edinburgh Centenary series.
Which is a really significant series that looks back at the 1910 World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, reflecting on key themes for Christian mission today.
So we're drawing on some serious thinking here, spanning over a century.
We are. And it's not just one viewpoint. The sources cover so much ground. Specific ethnic diasporas, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, South Asian communities.
Alongside the bigger picture stuff.
Exactly. Migration theory, religious diversity, the history of diaspora in mission, how it works today.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is clear. Unpack that relationship. Diaspora and the spread, the evolution of Christianity.
And find those surprising details, the insights that go, beyond just people moved.
Let's do it. So first things first, what exactly is diaspora and how is it different from, say, just migration? They sound similar.
They're definitely related, but not identical. Think of diaspora as maybe the bigger structure, the network that results from movement.
Okay.
While migration is the specific act, the moving itself.
So migration is the verb, diaspora is kind of the noun, the result.
That's a decent way to put it. And crucially, the essays emphasize that diaspora often involves keeping a connection to the homeland.
Ah, right. Not just leaving, but staying connected somehow.
Yeah, through memory, culture, maybe actual communication, family ties.
Yeah.
That persistent link is often what sets it apart from other kinds of migration where ties might fade.
So it's a dispersed community, but still a community with a shared origin point.
Precisely. And if you look at it from a missiological angle, thinking about the Great Commission,
Yeah.
the idea of diaspora gives a really broad scope for understanding mission. It's potentially wider than just focusing on the act of migrating.
Interesting. Okay, so connecting that to history. Migration has obviously played a huge role in how Christianity spread.
A massive role. But it's complex. It's been both a help and sometimes a hindrance.
Okay, how so? Give us an early example.
Well, think about the very beginnings. Christianity spreading beyond Jewish Palestine. How did that happen so quickly?
Good question.
It heavily relied on the existing Jewish diaspora. Those communities already scattered across the Mediterranean into Mesopotamia.
Ah, so the networks were already there.
Exactly. Synagogues in places like Antioch or Rome often became the first point of contact for early missionaries, like Barnabas and Paul.
We see that in Acts, right?
Yeah, Acts 13:14. They go to the synagogue first. And here's a fascinating twist.
Right.
Often, the Gentiles who are already sort of attracted to Judaism, the God-fearers, they sometimes proved more receptive to the Christian message than the diaspora Jews themselves.
Wow. So those existing connections were fertile ground, but maybe not always in the way you'd expect?
Exactly. Then there's the impact of persecution.
Right, like after Stephen's death in Acts 8.
Precisely. That forced scattering of believers from Jerusalem wasn't, a planned missionary strategy.
No.
But it directly led to the first cross-cultural missions, to Samaritans, the Ethiopian eunuch.
And eventually to Antioch. Huge consequences.
Enormous. It wasn't just forced movement. Think about voluntary migration within the Roman Empire.
People living for trade, administration.
Yeah, all roads led to Rome, right?
Yeah.
So you had these diverse, often Greek-speaking communities forming in the capital.
And that had an impact on church life.
Definitely. Think about that 2nd century Easter controversy. Victor of Rome, who was actually a migrant from North Africa.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he clashed with churches back in Asia Minor over the date of Easter. It highlights these interactions, even tensions, between different migrant Christian groups.
Amazing how migration patterns influenced even early theological debates. What about beyond the Roman Empire?
Same story, really. Wulfila and the Goths, their movements were partly driven by pressure from other migrating groups.
Right.
And of course, Patrick, taken to Ireland as a slave-forced migration.
And he becomes this key figure for Christianity there.
Exactly. It shows how even horrific circumstances could unexpectedly plant seeds of faith.
What about eastward, into Persia.
Christianity spread there too, even facing really severe persecution at times. And again, sometimes forced movement played a role. Well, there's this account of Christian captives taken from Roman territory. They were deported to Persia to work on imperial projects.
Okay.
And they ended up establishing a church that became distinctively Syriac and Iranian. It even influenced the local culture.
It's like the movement itself, forced or voluntary, just creates channels for beliefs to flow.
It really seems that way. Now, fast forward to around 1500. Christianity had declined in many of those early areas.
Right.
But then you get the age of European expansion, ocean-based migration over the next 4 or 5 centuries.
To the Americas, Africa, the Pacific.
Fundamentally reshaping the global religious map. And those European migrants had all sorts of motivations: economic, religious freedom, escaping persecution.
A real mix.
A real mix. And they carried their faith with them.
And then you mentioned the new migration more recently.
Yeah, that's generally referring to the big shifts after the colonial empires dismantled in the mid-20th century.
So people moving from former colonies to Europe.
That's part of it, reverse migration. And also the rise of guest workers moving to industrialized nations for jobs.
And these recent movements are key drivers of diversity today.
Absolutely key. Which brings us right up to contemporary trends.
Okay, so how has all this movement specifically impacted religious diversity now?
Well, the impact is undeniable. Global migration has led to a major increase in religious diversity almost everywhere.
In what ways?
2 main levels. You get intra-religious diversity, like think of all the different expressions of Christianity within the African diaspora in Europe, for example.
Right, different denominations, cultural styles.
Exactly. And then there's inter-religious diversity, different religions coexisting, like the increased presence of Islam alongside Christianity in many European cities.
And the sources say migration is a primary cause of this interreligious growth.
Yes, a major driver. The data backs this up. If you look at the Religious Diversity Index, the RDI, between 1910 and 2010, most regions saw an increase. But places like Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Eastern Asia, North America saw really notable jumps.
Largely due to migration.
Largely due to migration. It's getting rarer to find countries where, say, 90% follow just one world religion.
So the world's religious map is becoming much more complex, much more patchwork.
Definitely. Now, this often gets tied up with the idea of secularization.
Right. The assumption is more diversity, more modernity means less religion.
That's the common assumption. But the essays make a really important distinction.
Which is?
We need to separate the deinstitutionalization of religion, separating church and state, religion losing political power, from individual secularization, people actually losing personal faith or stopping religious practice.
And the argument is?
While political secularization has definitely happened in the West, the evidence for a dramatic drop in personal piety in, say, Western Europe or North America isn't actually that clear-cut.
Interesting. So institutions might weaken, but personal belief doesn't necessarily disappear at the same rate.
It seems much more complex than a simple decline narrative. And when we look at why people migrate today, we can broadly categorize it: voluntary seeking better economic or political situations, involuntary fleeing war, persecution, trafficking.
But it's probably often a mix, right?
Oh, absolutely. The lines are often blurry. You have complex push factors forcing people out and pull factors drawing them somewhere new. It's rarely just one thing.
Okay, so we've got the definitions, the history, the current trends. Let's shift to the theological side. How do the scriptures, starting with the Old Testament, reflect on this theme of migration?
The Old Testament is just steeped in it. That ancient creed in Deuteronomy 26 is a fantastic starting point.
The wandering Aramean part.
Exactly. It summarizes Israel's core story, and migration is woven all the way through.
So what are the key migration moments highlighted there?
Well, 3 big ones. First, the patriarchs themselves: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob is called that wandering or migrant Aramean.
Emphasizing their movement.
Constant movement. From Mesopotamia through Canaan, down to Egypt, back again. Even with God's promise of land, they were always moving, never fully settled for long stretches.
So displacement is there right from the foundation. What's the second?
Second is the whole Egypt experience. The sojourn there, leading to slavery, then the Exodus, and finally the conquest of Canaan.
And Egypt is portrayed complexly, isn't it?
Very. It's the land of slavery, yes, but it's also remembered as a place of refuge.
Right. Abraham went there during famine. Joseph rose to power there.
Exactly. Genesis shows it as an asylum, too. So it's both oppression and sanctuary in their collective memory.
A really interesting tension. And the third aspect.
The Babylonian exile. That forced displacement made those themes in the Deuteronomy Credo, wandering, being uprooted, incredibly relevant to the exiled Israelites.
It wasn't just ancient history anymore. It was their lived reality.
It transformed how they read their own story. And there's even this universal touch in Amos 9.7.
What does that say?
God basically compares Israel's exodus to the migrations of the Philistines and the Arameans. It suggests God's hand is in the movements of all peoples, not just Israel.
Wow, okay. So migration is central to the Old Testament story. How does the New Testament pick up these threads?
Well, Luke, especially in Acts, really emphasizes movement and crossing boundaries. Jesus tells his followers to preach repentance and forgiveness to all nations, starting from Jerusalem.
And we see that happen almost immediately.
Right away. Think of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8.
Yeah, classic story.
Here's this official from a foreign land. He encounters the gospel, gets baptized, and heads home.
And the implication is he takes the message with him.
Exactly. It shows the potential for the gospel to spread through individuals returning home, almost like unintentional missionaries.
But it wasn't always smooth sailing, right? Cross-cultural communication must have been challenging.
Oh, incredibly challenging. Acts shows that too. Paul's experiences as a Jewish migrant preaching in Greek cities.
Like in Lystra.
That's a perfect example. Acts 14. The locals think he and Barnabas are Zeus and Hermes.
Right. A total misunderstanding.
It just highlights the huge potential for miscommunication when you cross those cultural and religious divides.
So how did Paul handle that? What was his strategy?
He talks about it in 1 Corinthians 9, basically adapting his approach.
Becoming all things to all people.
That's the famous line, being sensitive to different audiences, Jews, Greeks, meeting them where they were, culturally speaking.
But without watering down the core message.
That was the crucial balance. Adapt the method, not the message.
Now, how does this relate to Pentecost in Acts 2? The miraculous speaking in tongues.
That's a great question. Pentecost was foundational, no doubt. God overcoming language barriers instantly.
Yeah.
But the essays suggest that the sustained, long-term spread of the gospel to all these different peoples relied heavily on the actual language skills and cross-cultural experience of diaspora Jews from those Hellenized Mediterranean cities.
So not just the Galileans suddenly speaking Parthian, but Jews who already knew Greek, who understood Roman culture.
Exactly. They had the tools, the experience needed to bridge those gaps day to day. Pentecost was the divine spark, perhaps, but the diaspora network provided the kindling and the pathways for the fire to spread.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so the Bible gives us this rich background. Let's jump to today. What are some contemporary examples of diaspora and mission in action?
The sources are full of them. Take African migrant pastors in Germany, for instance.
Okay, what's their experience been like?
Well, initially, many tried using evangelism methods from home open-air preaching, that sort of thing.
And how did that go over?
Often, not great. Language barriers, cultural differences, different theological assumptions. It was tough to connect with the local German population that way.
So what did they do?
Many shifted focus. They started concentrating on building congregations within the growing African diaspora communities in Germany.
Serving people with similar backgrounds.
Right. And now, there are estimates of maybe 1,000 congregations in Germany, led by Africans, mainly serving Africans. Hamburg is a real hub for this.
Wow, 1,000. That's significant. It shows that natural pull towards shared culture, especially when you're in a new place.
Definitely. Now, shift scale completely.
Right.
The Chinese diaspora,
The largest in the world, right?
by far. Huge populations in Southeast Asia, growing fast in Latin America, Africa. And think about the economic powerhouses, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan.
The little tigers.
Yeah.
Strong diaspora connections there.
Very strong. And there have been distinct waves of Chinese migration over time.
Leading to diverse communities today.
Yeah, you see it in places like the U.S. or Canada. Older Cantonese-speaking Chinatowns, newer, often more affluent Mandarin-speaking communities. It's incredibly varied.
Such a huge, complex network. What about Filipino migration? The sources call them missionaries. Why?
Well, Filipino migration has boomed, often driven by economics, contract labor. But core Filipino values are key. Strong family ties, they talk about KBL, and incredibly deep Christian faith, mostly Catholic.
Okay.
And because they are often so active in church life wherever they go, seeking community, support.
They naturally share their faith?
Exactly. The Catholic Church itself has noted this, calling them missionaries. They get involved, take leadership roles, witness through their lives. Being far from home often deepens their reliance on faith.
So faith isn't just personal comfort, it's active, communal, and naturally overflows.
That seems to be the case for many. Then there's a really interesting one. The Japanese diaspora in Brazil, the Nikkei,
What's happening?
facing hardship, isolation, many Nikkei Brazilians became really open to the gospel.
Okay.
And this has led to a kind of reverse mission. Brazilian pastors, often of Nikkei background themselves, are now going to Japan to minister, setting up Portuguese services for the Nikkei community there.
That's fascinating, the flow going back the other way.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Now think about the Persian Gulf. South Asian Christians.
Drawn by the oil boom.
Largely, many Christians migrated for work. But there's often a shortage of ordained clergy.
So who leads the churches?
Mostly lay leaders, people stepping up out of necessity and commitment.
And what are those communities like?
Often very passionate, spiritually, high church attendance, really generous giving back to missions in South Asia.
Despite potential restrictions.
Despite restrictions. But they face challenges too, lack of trained leaders. And the second generation often struggles with identity, feeling caught between cultures.
That second generation issue seems common. What about Korean diaspora churches, KDCs, in the U.S.? They grow fast, right?
Phenomenally fast. There's that joke. Wherever Koreans go, they plant churches. High attendance, fervent prayer, strong mission focus.
Sounds vibrant. Any challenges?
Oh, yes. Internal conflicts, sometimes over finances or between pastors and lay leaders. And then there's the silent exodus.
Meaning?
The English-speaking second generation often drifting away. They feel disconnected from the Korean language services, the culture of their parents' church. Bridging that gap is a huge task.
Yeah, that generational tension again. So, zooming out, how are immigrants, broadly speaking, changing Christianity in the U.S.?
In massive ways.
Yeah.
First, just demographic cities, towns becoming way more diverse.
Yeah.
Second, immigrant Christians are bringing huge vitality,
Yeah.
new perspectives, often numerical growth, especially to denominations that were declining.
Injecting new life.
Absolutely. And third, maybe surprisingly, non-Christian immigrants are often very receptive to the gospel message.
Really?
Yeah. Churches that intentionally welcome immigrants often see significant growth. Think of Willow Creek's outreach or the evangelistic passion of Bhutanese refugees who found faith after being resettled.
Incredible stories. It paints a picture of constant change, constant dynamism, driven by people moving.
That's right. And this leads to thinking about new ways of doing mission, new strategies.
Okay, so what new paradigms or practices are emerging for diaspora missions?
Well, the fact that societies are becoming more pluralized creates challenges, but also opportunities for churches. The sources compare today's Western Europe to Canada in the early 20th century.
When Canada was getting lots of European immigrants.
Yeah, exactly. Central Eastern Europeans. And how did the church respond then?
Good question. What did they do?
Take the missionary oblates. They set up ethnic personal parishes, specifically for Polish immigrants.
So Polish churches within Canada?
More than just churches, they were community hubs, small Polands, basically. Schools, newspapers, social clubs, all in Polish.
Wow. Providing that whole support system.
Crucial for integration, but also for preserving identity. It was a vital bridge.
Are we seeing similar things in Europe now with, say, African immigrant churches?
We're seeing the emergence of AICs, African International Churches, or CAOs, Churches of African Origin in the Diaspora.
Yeah.
And they often go through phases, starting quite inward-looking, serving their own group, then opening up more, and eventually moving towards real interculturation, mixing with others.
And how do they relate to the established European churches?
Different models. Sometimes they just exist side by side. Sometimes one is a guest in the other's building. But the most promising are mediational models.
Meaning?
Real partnership, mutual learning, sharing resources, transforming each other. That's where the real potential lies.
And this links to the idea of mission by migrants, right? Not just to them.
Exactly. There's growing recognition that these migrant-led churches in Europe and the U.S. are a major force in global mission themselves.
Some even see them as revitalizing Western Christianity.
Yes, bringing energy, different perspectives, vibrant faith back into more secularized contexts.
Now, there was also that case study of migrants trying to integrate into a native British church. What drove them?
Several things. Some disliked the idea of churches being only one ethnicity. They wanted a broader community, wanted to integrate more into British society.
And how did they see mission?
Broadly, witness, yes, but also service, practical help, living out their faith daily. But they faced challenges too.
Like,
Cultural sensitivities, especially at work. Feeling awkward about sharing faith in a more individualistic, maybe secular workplace. Navigating those differences.
needs real awareness on all sides. What about South Korea? It's become a center for diaspora missions, too.
Definitely. Some great examples. The Honorary M Center in Ansan ministers to all sorts of migrant worker services in many languages. Social support.
That sounds vital.
There's Daddy, a multicultural school for migrant kids. And Filipino ministries in Korea are planting churches back in the Philippines.
Wow. And the churches at sea?
Yeah. Training Filipino seafarers to be lay church planters on their ships. Establishing faith communities right there on the vessels.
Incredible ingenuity. And the Lausanne movement, the big evangelical network, they're focused on diaspora, too.
Very much so. They call it a Kairos opportunity, a crucial moment.
What are they urging?
For Christians in host countries to actively love and serve immigrants, whatever their background. Kinetic mission models, active engagement, relationship building, crossing cultures intentionally.
So, reaching out beyond just fellow Christians in the diaspora.
Absolutely. Serving the whole community.
Okay, let's wrap up with some of the broader theological frameworks. Beyond the specific Bible stories, how else do the sources help us understand diaspora theologically?
Well, that Sur Bible Translation Project is a good example of a holistic approach.
How so?
It wasn't just about linguistics. They worked with the Sur diaspora community, addressing their practical needs to social, economic, educational.
A real partnership.
A symbiotic partnership. That's key for diaspora-based work like translation.
Going back a bit, John R. Mott's work with international students, how does that fit?
Mott was ahead of his time, really. He saw the huge potential of international students in North America back in the early 20th century.
As future leaders.
Exactly. Agents of change back home. He pushed Christian student groups to engage with them seriously. This laid the groundwork for international student ministries, ISM, even before diaspora was the buzzword.
So seeing the strategic importance of people on the move?
Precisely. Then there are powerful metaphors in Scripture.
Like the forsaken woman in Isaiah.
Yes, Isaiah 62. It offers this deeply empathetic lens for understanding the experience of marginalized, displaced people.
Including victims of trafficking.
Yes, it connects their pain to God's promise of restoration, redemption, belonging for those who feel abandoned. It gives hope.
And Pentecost, again, beyond the languages, what's the deeper theological point about culture?
Acts 2 isn't just individuals getting the Spirit. It's diverse languages and cultures being redeemed to declare God's power.
So conversion doesn't erase culture.
The suggestion is it purifies and redeems the world in its complexity. It affirms diversity, doesn't flatten it.
There is also that very personal reflection from the Chinese-Malaysian immigrant author, Living in Between.
Right. That piece really highlights the tensions, but also the richness of navigating multiple identities.
Holding on to heritage while embracing a new context.
Yeah, and the complex theological questions that raises about Christian identity, ancestry, Israel, Judaism. It suggests maybe being aliens and strangers isn't marginal to faith.
But central.
Maybe central. Inviting us to see diaspora, hybridity as key themes, not problems.
It all seems to lead towards seeing the church as truly global, interconnected, where everyone belongs, regardless of where they started or where they are now.
That's a powerful conclusion for the sources. We're all part of one body.
Okay, so let's try and pull the main threads together. Key takeaways. First, diaspora is huge, growing, and deeply affecting religion globally.
Undeniably.
Second, migration, though complex, has been and still is absolutely crucial for how Christianity spreads and changes.
Can't understand Christian history without it.
Third, today's diasporas drive religious diversity, creating unique opportunities and challenges for mission.
Both sides of the coin, definitely.
Fourth, thinking theologically about migration isn't new. It's deeply rooted in both the Old and New Testaments.
It's woven into the fabric of Scripture.
And finally, engaging diaspora communities effectively means cultural sensitivity, new thinking, and seeing the global church as truly connected.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
So here's something for you, our listener, to chew on. As the world keeps connecting, as people keep moving, how is this reality of global diaspora shaping your understanding of faith? your practice?
Hmm.
And maybe more pointedly, what role could you play right where you are in building understanding, fostering connection across the diverse communities around you?
It's a challenge for all of us.
Definitely something worth reflecting on. We hope this deep dive gave you some useful perspectives and maybe sparked some new questions.